With support from the NIHCM, the National Institute for Healthcare Management, we've created a 3-episode series about how drugs get approved in the United States, the exceptions to the normal rules of approval, and what some major issues have been and how things have changed or may change in the future. In the first episode, we discussed the drug approval process from the discovery phase to what happens after approval. In this second episode, we talk about what happens when the usual rules don't apply. That's the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. The ways in which drugs get approved in the United States have always been an issue that people feel strongly about. Some believe that the FDA is too slow, depriving people of the chance to take life-saving medications that might make a difference. Others believe that the FDA is not careful enough, approving medications that are still risky or dangerous, or where the risks potentially outweigh the benefits. As we detailed last week, it can take up to 15 years for a drug to get from the lab to the market, and only a small number of drugs make it that far. There are, however, exceptions to the rules. Some of these exceptions aren't too controversial, like abbreviated drug applications. These are shorter ways to gain approval for generic drugs when the brand name drug has already gone through the original approval process. In this case, drug makers just have to provide proof that their generic version is comparable to the initial drug in things like dose and strength. Think of things like the many forms of ibuprofen that are available in addition to Advil, the original brand. For new drugs, though, there are several pathways through which they might get approved more quickly or receive more support from the FDA. This often applies to drugs for serious or life-threatening conditions for which no other treatment is available. One of these pathways is called accelerated approval. After an investigational new drug application, or IND, is filed, which we described in episode 1, a drug may qualify for this accelerated pathway and be approved for limited use based on surrogate endpoints. That means markers that predict a clinical benefit but don't actually measure a clinical benefit. Even when granted an accelerated approval, the drug maker still has to move forward with what are called phase 4 confirmatory trials to prove, or not, the medication's ability to affect actual clinical endpoints. But making the medication available in the meantime lets patients without other options try it much sooner than they would otherwise normally be able. Aduhelm, a drug for Alzheimer's disease, was approved via this pathway in 2021, with data that suggested the drug was effective at reducing brain plaques, the surrogate endpoint, associated with Alzheimer's disease, without yet knowing if it actually reduces symptoms of Alzheimer's or the clinical endpoint. This approval was controversial, which we'll get into in the next episode. A fast track designation can be requested by a drug company at any point during the development process for a drug that fills an unmet medical need in a serious condition. This may include improvements in survival, daily functioning, or prevention of disease progression. For example, AstraZeneca received Fast Track designation in 2021 for a drug to be used in adult patients with chronic kidney disease at risk of progressing. The drug is intended to reduce the risk of things like end-stage kidney disease, cardiovascular death, and hospitalization or heart failure in this population. When a drug is granted Fast Track status, it is then potentially entitled to things like more support from the FDA on a development plan and data collection, eligibility for accelerated approval, and rolling review, meaning sections of their application can be reviewed rather than having to wait for the entire application to be complete before review. A drug can also receive a breakthrough therapy designation if initial clinical evidence suggests that it can improve clinically significant outcomes in ways not achievable by currently available drugs. In 2016, Janssen received a breakthrough therapy designation for esketamine, a drug for treatment-resistant major depressive disorder that we discussed in a previous series. When this designation is granted, the drug maker is eligible for all of the features of the Fast Track designation, plus intensive guidance on their drug development program. The primary purpose of this designation is to advance the evidence required for approval in the most efficient way possible. Janssen's esketamine drug received FDA approval in 2019. And one last pathway, which is probably the most controversial, is expanded access, also called compassionate use. This comes into play for people with immediately life-threatening conditions who have exhausted all treatment options, are unable to enroll in clinical trials, and for which the potential benefit of the drug justifies its potential risks. These drugs have not garnered FDA approval, and neither their safety nor efficacy has been verified, though the drug must have already completed a phase 1 clinical trial where some safety information is gathered. Compassionate use is a pathway for single patients to gain access to an experimental drug when they are at the end of their treatment options for a rare disease or a disease like cancer or AIDS. But it's not as straightforward as you might think, and we'll cover that in next week's episode. While this isn't an exhaustive list of the exception, it covers many of the major ones and sets the stage for next week's episode, the last in this series, where we'll get into some of the latest controversies about drug approval. Hope to see you there. Hey, did you enjoy this episode? You might enjoy this previous episode on Aduhelm, the Alzheimer's drug granted accelerated approval in 2021. We always like it if you'll subscribe to the channel down below or like the video. And if you go on over to patreon.com/healthcaretriage, you can help support the show, make it bigger and better. We'd especially like to thank our research associates, James Glasgow, Joe Sevitz, Edward Littleholm, and Brian Nam, and of course, our Surgeon Admiral, Sam.